Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm Tyler Alderson, your host for this week, and one of the moderators over at r/Ask Historians. And joining me is another one of your friendly moderators, Seb Lewin. Thank you so much for joining me, Seb.
Thank you for having me, Tyler, and thank you for saying I'm a friendly moderator.
You seem very
I
friendly.
hope people agree.
Well, today we are talking about a region of the world that I think is often overlooked when we're talking about classical music, and that is Latin America. We're going to be discussing not only the history of Latin American classical music, but some of the names that Seb has picked out and that have made some incredible music over the years. We're going to talk about what actually brings all of this massive region together in terms of music, what makes certain places different. And we are going to get some recommendations from Seb as well that you will be able to listen to on the Reddit post that accompanies this episode. So definitely check that out. Listen to that once you've listened to this, because he sent me over some of these links before we started. And there's some really fantastic music. So we're going to get into all that. And I guess we'll start with Latin America itself, huge region. What exactly, when we're talking about Latin American music, is there? What's the thread that runs through it? Is that even a useful label? Because we're talking from essentially Mexico on down to the bottom of Argentina and Chile. That's a lot of people in a lot of different regions and all that.
Yeah, one of the interesting things when it comes to Latin America is that no one is actually entirely sure how to divide Latin America because we have geographical distinctions, cultural distinctions, economic distinctions. But when it comes to music, I think it's a safe bet to call it Latin American classical musical as much as it's a safe bet to call it classical music. Because as you know, one of the huge debates within the musicological sphere, whether you are an ethnomusicologist, a regular musicologist, a historian of music, is the fact that nobody actually knows how to call what we study when it comes to what we usually call art music or academic music. Because we call it classical music for to make it easier, because well, it's what we most often associate this particular kind of music with, the classical period. But it's basically just that. When it comes to it, it's only a specific period, and if we consider classical music to encompass Baroque music, we kind of forget that the classical people invented the term Baroque in order to basically diss on the Baroque composers. But here in Latin America, the process of creating compositional styles came a little late compared to Europe, because not only because of the Spanish conquista and the Portuguese conquest, but also because of the fact that during the colonial era, both in South and Central America, the only music that was played was European music, the music that people were listening to in Spain and in Portugal. So the only real moment when we start seeing properly Latin American composition comes following the independence movements after the Haitian Revolution of 1804, and particularly after the Argentinian Revolution of 1810. I would say that that's the moment in which we at least start to get a glimpse of what's going to eventually become a more properly Latin American composition style. So that's why I wanted to start off with one particular composer who was actually born in 1810, Juan Bautista Alberdi. When it comes to Alberdi, most people don't really know that he was a musician, because he's a very important figure in Argentinian history. Because he was essentially the ideologist for our national constitution. He was a lawyer. He wasn't a professional musician. He was a lawyer. He was an economist. He was a politician. He was many things. but most people don't know that he was also very fond of music, and he was a very interesting composer, at least for the time in which he composed. Most of what he wrote were waltzes and some minuets, especially in the French minuet style and the Austrian, the Viennese waltz style. And again, as I was telling you, this is a period in which, even though we start to see some compositions made in Latin America for Latin American audiences, they are still heavily influenced and heavily attached to Europe and its influence within the cultural makeup of Latin America. If
Actually, one
you, yeah,
question I would have with that is when we're talking about someone like Alberti, when he was composing, was he even thinking of himself as a South American, or the music that he was making as being South American, or are you still very much just looking to that European mindset, and even some people maybe thinking of themselves as European?
yeah, that's also a very interesting question. Most of the people who were involved in the early independence movements from 1810 onwards, during the entire process of the construction of the Argentinian state, didn't consider themselves to be European in itself, because being European would mean they were Spanish, because they were all descended from the Spanish. But they did want to be like certain Europeans, particularly like the French. They were very keen on interpreting and on applying the ways in which the French carried themselves in their lives, in their politics, and in their culture. Because, as you know, as you probably know, most of the Latin American constitutions are based in two constitutions: the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the First French Republic. Those two pieces of constitutional history have shaped the way in which most Latin American, particularly most South American countries, created and constructed their statehood. And that also applied and that also carried itself into cultural production and creation. So when Alberti wrote music, he wrote music from, you could say, from a conflicting standpoint, because he felt and he saw himself as an Argentinian citizen, but the ideal citizen, the ideal Argentinian and South American and Latin American citizen, was supposed to be very much like the ideal French and United States citizen. So it's a very complex, and it's a very difficult place to be in when it comes to creating music. I mean, he was trying to, when you listen to his waltzes and his minuets, you can see and you can feel that he was trying to make something new, something authentic, something autochthonous even, but he couldn't completely detach himself from what he had been taught was proper music, proper etiquette, because we're talking about a person, as most composers have been in Latin America and in history in general, who have been either on the elite, economically speaking and socially speaking, or at least very close to being elite.
And that's a big another big question that I had, and especially in this time period, because as we'll get to later, there's definitely a lot of folk influence and influence from indigenous music, or African and Afro Caribbean, Afro Latino music. But at this point, especially early on, it seems like we're still operating a bit out of that, both culturally, in terms of the Europeanness, as we've talked about, and socioeconomically, we're still operating out of classical music as that signifier of an elite, and being a part of that elite group of people, and the music reflecting that, not necessarily reflecting as much of the popular.
Absolutely, absolutely. We are still in a period in which music is very much attached to a socioeconomic position that is among the elite, that is among the ruling class, which is also very important among what we now call the political class. We know today that music and that art in general has always been very attached to and very connected to politics and to the expression of power within a society, whether it is to adhere to this power or to rebel against it. During this particular period, music is still very much constructed in order to solidify the creation of new political institutions, to solidify the legitimacy of these political institutions and these newly formed governments and units of power within several of Latin America's countries.
So when we're talking about, because this is a guy who is a founder in many ways of a lot of the not just music, and this is something that's just so fascinating, is not just musically, but politically and legally, as you know, has a lot of influence in so much of what goes on in South America and especially in Argentina. And so this is almost like a creation in many ways of this new society, but as you say, modeled after. And honestly, I would have thought Spain, given that that Argentina was a colony of Spain, but actually it seems like modeled after, say, more like France or perhaps the U.S.
Yeah, it's interesting because basically the most accurate comparison I can make is that Alberti is essentially one of our founding fathers.
Mm.
He's basically I don't know, George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, one of the, even though he wasn't directly involved in the revolution because he was born the year the revolution happened. He was born in 1810. He did create the basis upon which the Argentinian state was erected. So when you think about the I mean, it's a valid question, the one you make about Spain. I mean, we speak Spanish, we don't speak French, we don't speak English. We are a traditionally Catholic country, much like the Spanish. We are a traditionally Catholic continent, even. Um, but when it comes to actually developing a national culture and identity, I think that the idea was to go as far away as possible from the Spaniards. For example, if you listen to or if you read the verses of our original national anthem, which is a very long national anthem, it had to be cut down because I think it lasted 15 minutes. Um, yeah,
Oh man.
it's gigantic. It was written by Vicente López y Planes and Blas Parera in 1813. And if you read the original text, the original lyrics, it's basically La Marseillaise on steroids. It's the vast majority of the text is about killing Spaniards. It's extremely aggressive. Uh,
Sounds like a
ev-
fun piece.
yeah, but so much so, it was so aggressive against Spain and against the Spanish rule and against the Spanish, even the Spanish common citizen and the common soldier, that during the 1880s, the president Julio Argentino Roca decided that it was a little bit too extreme because we wanted to become friends with Spain again because we wanted to commerce and to trade with the Spanish. So he decided that we needed to make it a little bit shorter and to maybe remove the idea of Spain being vanquished at our feet. Um,
Oh yeah, yeah.
but during the early period, I can safely say that most of the cultural production here in Argentina and in many Spanish American countries, the idea was usually to just remove Spain as much as possible, even to the point in which you can go to several South American capital cities, maybe excluding Lima. and maybe excluding Mexico in Central America, and you will see that most of the original Spanish architecture from the colonial period is gone. It was eventually replaced by a lot of buildings constructed in the style of Louis XV. So when you go to Buenos Aires, for example, there are several historical buildings which basically look like you're in France, you're in Paris. All of a sudden, it's very weird. And we
it's
even have some cities modeled entirely. For example, Cordoba, which is the second biggest city in Argentina, is basically exactly modeled after Paris. It has diagonals everywhere, roundabouts everywhere, because the idea again was to mimic the country that had given us the revolution, the country that had showed us, at least during the short time the first French Republic wasn't under the terror, it had showed us that we were able to overthrow the monarchy.
That's such an interesting point. And as a side note, for anybody listening, I would highly recommend visiting Buenos Aires and Argentina. It's a wonderful city, and a lot of the architecture. Now that you mention it, does have a very kind of French look to it. It's definitely really interesting place, and that's actually something that I wanted to get into as we move. We talked about Alberti, and we can talk about him a little bit more, but also most of the other composers that you wanted to talk about today, I noticed were much later than him, and sort of once Argentina seems to, and various other countries around Latin America seems to have gotten a much stronger self identity, moving away from that feeling. And just as we leave Alberti and move towards some of the other composers, how how is that reflected in the music, that's starting to build that sense away from simply looking towards Europe?
Okay, so that's a very nice segue, by the way. I really like that. But yeah, so when it comes to the 19th century, I decided not to focus too much on it because of what we were saying about the most of the classical world being entirely dependent on Europe. But during the 19th century, we also saw the development of folk music in Latin America. Again, after the revolution periods and the gaining of independence by most South American and Central American countries, we started to see a lot of people in the countryside outside of the big cities starting to create their own form of culture, their own folkloric music. And during the 20th century, particularly during the early 20th century, we can see a shift within the musical world, within the classical area and the academic area of music, towards giving more appreciation and without and valuing considerably more these these different forms of cultural expression that were and still are considered to be particularly subaltern because they belong to the minority, they belong to the countryside, they belong to the farmer and the cattle keeper, and they are very far away from the huge ballrooms and from society. So when you see so many composers during the 20th century shifting towards incorporating folkloric influences into their music, what you have is a new way to find and to rediscover our culture as Argentinians, as Chileans, as Peruvians, as Venezuelans, Mexicans, and also as Latin Americans. Um, this particular trend, that's exactly what I wanted to talk about. Most composers from the 20th century, because this particular trend has completely and absolutely transformed the way we look at classical music here in Latin America. Because nowadays, when we think about Latin American classical music, it's essentially nothing like European classical music. there is very little in common today except for the use of regular orchestra ensembles and of European instruments. Outside from that, you will find very people in Latin America composing rhapsodies or symphonies or even concertos. Most people, most composers in Latin America will start creating new ways to develop music that fall way outside the regular parameters and structures of European and even North American classical music. So, for example, we have another Argentinian composer called Alberto Ginastera, who was born in 1916 and who was he's a very interesting character in Argentina and in Latin America in general because he is without a doubt the most renowned Latin American composer in the world. Um, he was a student of Aaron Copland, so anyone who has ever heard about Aaron Copland knows where this is going. Uh, Nobody who studied under Aaron Copland composed regular and normal music. Um, and Ginastera was not an exception. He he was a child prodigy with the piano, but he was never particularly interested in playing. He wanted to create music, and he found his calling and his style in mixing two very different things: Argentinian folk music and atonality. Which for those listening to this who may not have heard about atonality because it's not the most widely used form of composition today. Atonality is the idea, is the form of composition and style of composition in which you create music without a tonal center. That is, when in regular music we have tonal centers, which is from where the melody stems. So in atonality, there is basically the melody doesn't come from anywhere. It's a very peculiar form of composition because the melody isn't supposed to follow any kind of normal structure or pattern. That's essentially the idea. The idea is to break away from the vast majority of the traditional European standards and structures of composition, in which atonality gave birth to several other forms of composition like 12-tone technique, which we will talk about a little bit more further, and serialism. But the idea is that you can create music that is unpredictable. The center the center of tonality, paradoxically speaking, is the fact that the objective is to have the listener not be able to predict what's going to happen next. And Ginastera was very fond of this particular way of composing music. But the genius behind Ginastera's creations comes from being able to amalgamate and to mix atonality and the idea of unpredictability with actual folkloric styles and dance forms and music forms which have a structure, which have a sense of predictability. Um, so we consider to be Ginastera our Chopin or our Tchaikovsky. Not only because of his achievements, but also because of his nationalism when it came to music, because he included folkloric themes in almost everything he composed. His most renowned work, which I highly recommend and for which we will probably leave a link on the Reddit post, is called Las Danzas Argentinas, the Argentine Dances, which are a series of piano pieces which were then adapted and arranged for orchestra as well, which revolve around essentially the life of a farmer in the countryside and the farmer's wife and just people living their lives in a very rough and very harsh environment and living conditions because people in the countryside here in Argentina during the late 1900s and early 20th century lived very difficult lives, much like people in the countryside and farmers and cowboys all over the world. And Ginastera was particularly fond of the idea behind a figure, a cultural figure called the gaucho, which is basically our cowboy. They're a little bit earlier than the regular American cowboy, but they are essentially the same. They're this person who lives in his ranch with his animals and very very far away from the city and from the lights and from the chaos. Who lives a peaceful existence, but also a very an existence with a lot of sacrifices, with a lot of enduring a lot of pain, enduring droughts and famine and sickness to his cattle. So there's a very peculiar component in Ginastera's music when it comes to creating this counterpoint, because in essence what he did was found a counterpoint between folk music, traditional folk music, and atonality as a concept.
And he's somebody who, as you said, has currency, not only as a Latin American composer, but as somebody who has really broken into some of the biggest concert halls around the world in his own right, in the sense that he's one of the biggest exports in terms of Latin American classical music.
Absolutely, yes, no, without a doubt.
And you mentioned something that I find really interesting, because he studied with Copeland, and this whole point of looking towards the folk music and actually highlighting the simplicity, the roughness of life. That's a far cry from, as we were talking about before, the high society and the man. And I mean, he was somebody who was from Buenos Aires, so ostensibly he also liked some of the finer things, but yet looking towards, much like Copeland did with things like Appalachian Spring, the folk music and the simplicity of country life, of rural life, or the hardships they face as the true character of the country.
Yeah, definitely. There's a sort of a disconnect, a weird disconnect when it comes to a person having been born in Buenos Aires in a relatively high society family, because he wasn't particularly poor or anything like that. He was from a an upper middle class family. And even though he, there, this is absolutely, and this is a absolute disclaimer. This is entirely my conjecture and my hypothesis. But Ginastera was in a line of teachers and students, a very long line of teachers and students, because Ginastera was a student of Aaron Copland, who in turn was a student of Nadia Boulanger, who had been a student of Gabriel Fauré, who had been a student of Camille Saint-Saëns. So it's a very long line that, if I'm not mistaken, it goes back to like Muzio Clementi. Um, but there's
Sounds about right.
something there's there's a very distinctive element when it comes to most of these people who studied and learned from the other. Most of them wrote stuff for everyday life. When you think about, for example, nowadays the most renowned work by Saint-Saëns is the Carnival of the Animals, and maybe the introduction and Rondo Capriccioso, and those are not particularly high society pieces when you really think about it. During a time in which most composers were interested in creating music that tried to reflect glories of ages past, because Romanticism creates a lot of this idea of coming back to the freedom of the Baroque period and of being able to showcase the wonders of nature and the majestic creations of humanity and nature. And these are people who created music much more down to earth. I would call it, than most of their contemporaries, and that's of course very true, particularly for Copland. Um,
Yes, absolutely. And Foray had a very definitely a very melodic and very in some places very earthly and kind of popular ear. With a lot of his songs are I guess what you'd call accessible in many
yeah,
ways. Is very
absolutely, absolutely,
so.
and that's something that we also see very often in the composers I brought today. Something for everyone, something that could be enjoyed as much as possible by everyday people.
So while we're while we're talking about all this enjoyed by everyday people,
Yeah,
which is something that I think most of the composers that you sent over uh, probably fall under that category.
yeah,
The,
I know
this
where
next
you're going with
composer
this.
that that you sent over is in many ways the exact opposite. And I
Absolutely,
think of when I'm trying to recommend to my friends who don't necessarily like classical music to go to a concert, the things that I tend not to recommend, unless I know that they're very into this sort of thing, are the 12 tone music, because it can be a little tough to get into if you're not
yeah.
quite prepared for it. And that's, I'm sure there are going to be 12 tone people who say that that's unfair, and I apologize for that. That's where I'm coming from. But it's also, it can be a very cerebral music. It can be a music that we're talking about all this earthiness here. And the next person, Jacqueline Nova, from well, born in Belgium, I think you said, and then sort of associated with Colombia, having grown up there, is very much in that camp. We're not talking about gaucho music with her, are we?
No, not at all. Not one bit. But we'll get to the human element of Nova's music in a second. So yeah, Jacqueline Nova was born in Belgium in 1935, but her family was from Colombia, and his father decided to go back to Colombia when she was 7. So she was raised in Colombia. She was basically Colombian, and she was another child prodigy with the piano, who also didn't want to study interpretation. She didn't want to perform. She just wanted to create music because she had music in her mind and she needed to let it out. And she found a way to create that music thanks to Ginastera, who was her teacher in Buenos Aires, who taught her 12 tone, which and also serialism, because she combined both in her works. She wrote a lot of incidental music, but also many concert and chamber pieces. For those of us who don't know what 12 tone is and serialism, w- yeah, we understand you, and it's okay. There's nothing wrong with not knowing what it is, because as you were saying, they are both very peculiar styles of composition. Very briefly, the idea behind 12 tone technique, which is also called dodecaphony, we call it dodecaphony here in Spanish. Here in Spanish, that sounded weird, huh? Spanish is a place now. Okay. Moving on. 12 tone is the idea that you have to consider each and every one of the 12 notes within the chromatic scale as equals, as notes that are in no way subordinated to one another. So there, for 12 tone composers, there's not an overarching hierarchy between the notes. Every note is the same. Every note has the same value, and therefore have to be used freely. Because the idea behind 12 tone and serialism is to be as free as possible. Although serialism came to be as a sort of, it's considered to be an evolution of 12 tone actually. But serialism goes one step further. The idea behind serialism, this is very strange, but the idea behind serialism is that um, not only are the notes in the chromatic scale equal, they have to be used equally. So when you use one of those notes, when you write one of those notes, you have to write the other 11 notes before you can write the original note again, which is a very complicated way of looking at the world and looking at a score, in the beginning, when surrealism was first developed, it got a lot of criticism, not only because the music that comes out from both 12 tone and surrealism, it tends to be very weird, sounds very peculiar, but also because the idea was to break from structures. The idea, it's a contemporary movement to Dada in the literary circles, and the idea is technically supposed to be as free as possible, but it's a very structured way of composing when you actually look at it, because if you have to use every single one of the notes before you can go back again, you are also creating a structure. But what Nova did was she took these two ways and these two compositional styles, and she broke them apart. She is one of the most extreme 12 tone and serialist composers I've ever listened to. Yeah, and you should give me your notes on what I sent you from her.
It's we will have, and it's up on the Reddit post for the episode. You can listen to it. It's certainly, again, I hesitate with all this because, as they say, different strokes for different folks, and there are people who will find this very interesting, very appealing, even to listen to, and I don't want to tell them that they're weird. For me, it's can be very hard, especially on the first listen. I think if you
Hmm.
with a lot of I find with a lot of 12 tone, if you listen to it a few times, it starts to become easier to sort of figure out where exactly everything fits in.
Yeah,
But at the start, certainly when you listen to it, it can feel very much like there's all this stuff happening and I don't quite know why. Um, if that makes any sense.
yeah, yeah. No, it
Um,
makes perfect sense. I don't particularly enjoy listening to 12 tone or serialism, but I understand and I appreciate the significance, the cultural significance, particularly, and the impact it had on the history of composition, because there's a very human element behind it. There's a lot of statements written on the scores. What Nova does with her music, which is very powerful and very dark, it's always very dark music, which somehow it reminds me a lot of Lily Boulanger's music. She, to me, when I listen to Nova's works, she's talking about her sufferings. She's talking about a stormy feelings, a stormy life. In this sense, it really reminds me a lot of the Sturm und Drang movement in Europe during the late classical period and the very, very beginning of the Romantic era. In a sense that even though one may not necessarily enjoy listening to the sounds, because sometimes the sounds can be very harsh and can be even aggressive, when you are able to move past that particular aspect, I think that you can find a very human element, a very, even in some levels, a very intrinsically animalistic and instinctive element behind the music.
Now, as we move on, we're going to be talking about a country that I think is so very if you talk about Latin American classical music, it's so very tied up in that because of the guy at the head of the LA Philharmonic and because of the sistema that he came out of. A lot of people, when they think of Latin American classical music, Venezuela features very heavily. Can you maybe give a brief overview of not only Romero as a composer, but also the country that he comes from?
When we think about Venezuela as a country, we, at least here in Latin America, we recognize it as one of the most important countries when it comes to music because of El Sistema, which, to those of us who don't know what it is, El Sistema was a creation of a composer and music pedagogue called Jose Antonio Abreu, who created and devised a system in order to be able to reach young people, children, and teenagers from impoverished communities and slums in the biggest cities in Venezuela, and to reach out to them across the country with classical music. So El Sistema was created in order to fund and to finance the development of public youth orchestras, from which, of course, as you were mentioning, Gustavo Dudamel came. And but when we look at Venezuela as a country, when in terms of music, we usually think about El Sistema, but we forget about the composers who were actually living there a long time prior to Abreu's creation of El Sistema. And the guy I wanted to talk about today is Aldemaro Romero, who is a very interesting composer because he was one of the first composers to create a purely and completely eclectic form of composition, because he was born in 1928 in the city of Valencia in Venezuela, and he was the son of a conductor who taught him how to sing and how to play different instruments. But his father wanted him to be a classical musician and eventually a classical composer or even a conductor like himself. But Romero wasn't really interested in classical music. He enjoyed it, but he was far more interested in folk music, particularly in different forms of dance music from Venezuela. And he was extremely fond of the most traditional form of dance in Venezuela, which is called the joropo. So over time, he decided to create music, to compose music that was, again, as I was saying, as eclectic as possible, in which he created and composed music that combined aspects from the joropo traditional dance with more classical elements, particularly with classical instruments. So he would write joropos for the violin or for the piano, when the joropo is usually played with percussion instruments, with regular native instruments, not with European ones. And over time, he grew to be incredibly famous to the point in which he went to live to the US, and he collaborated and he became good friends with people like Dean Martin, Tito Puente, Stan Kenton, Jerry Lewis, because he eventually, during his time in the US, he also became very infatuated with jazz music. And this entire part of his life was during the 50s. And when he decided to return to Venezuela, he went back with a very specific idea. He wanted to create a new way to play Venezuelan folk music, to perform particularly joropo again. So what he did was amalgamate joropo, jazz, and bossa nova into what we now call the onda nueva, the new wave, um, which is not a particularly common. Again, it's in this regard, even though it's not 12 tone, it's also relatively similar to Jacqueline Nova in the sense that it breaks apart a lot of the key components of the three musical genres and create something completely new. So, for example, the joropo um, is very reliant on two particular instruments, on the harp and the maracas, which the maracas are percussion instruments. Um, and what he did was he replaced, or at least he combined. It depends on which piece we are talking about. Sometimes he completely outright replaced the harp and the maracas. Other times he just combined it. So the harp he would replace or combine with the piano and the double bass. And the maracas he would just outright replace them for a battery, which is a completely different percussion instrument, like polar opposites. But in the end, he would create something, a style that lives on to this day. The vast majority of Venezuelan musicians and composers today recognize the new wave created by Aldemaro Romero as the turning point in the history of Venezuelan music, which is why I wanted to include him, because there are other very important composers in Venezuelan history. I mean, Aldemaro Romero is not the only important composer in their history. For example, we also have Lauro. Antonio Lauro created the Venezuelan waltzes, which are also very important pieces of Venezuelan music history. But regardless of that, Aldemaro Romero gave them a new way to experience. And again, we go back to what you were saying earlier. a new way to perform and a new way to identify themselves with their own culture.
I think of when you talk about that, and especially when you're mentioning people like Dean Martin and Stan Kenton, the forays that people like Duke Ellington did from jazz, a very popular. I mean, he was one of the biggest names in music for a while, and then but also incorporating classical music and creating some of his really kind of genre straddling pieces that work just as well with a big band in a big band jazz setting as they do at a symphony hall. It seems like Romero was somebody who could be in, sounds like, multiple different worlds at once and take little pieces from them and bring it all together.
Definitely.
We're going to move back to your country, and back to Ariel Ramirez, Argentinian, Argentina. Very well known. I'd have to say, you're talking about Venezuela being well known for music. I think a lot of people, especially here in the States, would think of Argentina as also being extremely well known for your music there. And he was someone who really connected with a lot of the musical heritage of Argentina as a whole.
Absolutely. When it comes to Ariel Ramirez, he's probably the composer who most enjoyed listening and applying different styles from different parts of the country. Because Ginastera was particularly fond of music from the province of Buenos Aires. But he didn't necessarily include a lot of stuff from other places, except in some of his works. Most of his themes come from Buenos Aires and from the area of the Pampas near Buenos Aires. Ariel Ramirez changed this particular way of looking at music because he actually preferred folk music from the northern parts of the country, which share a lot of similarities with most of Andean folkloric music. During he was again another child prodigy. He was very
Sensing a
interested.
pattern here.
Yeah, yeah, right. It's like every single person we ever write and ever research about in classical music was a child prodigy. Um, but this particular composer was more interested in folk music than classical music above all else. I mean, he enjoyed classical music, but he believed in the power of using folk styles in order to actually and properly represent Argentinian culture in the outside world. So when he was 20 years old, he met one of the most important icons in Argentinian music, Héctor Roberto Chavero, who is best known for his stage name Atahualpa Yupanqui. He was one of the most important guitarists and folklorists of our entire history. And when he listened to Ramirez playing some of his pieces, he told him that he should travel across the country. He should get to meet the people he was being inspired by. And so Ramirez did so. He spent 10 years traveling across Argentina, listening and learning from the people who actually created the music styles he was in love with. And in the end, he used that knowledge to create a very different and very new way of interpreting classical music in Latin America. During the 60s, he created and he composed his most important work, which is called the Misa Criolla, the Criolla Mass. This came to be following the Second Vatican Council in 1962, in which, among many other things, it was decided that Catholic priests would be allowed to say Mass in their native language instead of the traditional Latin. And so, when the liturgy for the Catholic Mass was translated to Spanish, Ramirez, who was a devout Catholic, found himself faced with the possibility to fulfill a lifelong dream of his. He had always wanted to create a Latin American piece of sacred music, of religious music. And so when the mass was translated into Spanish, he found the opportunity to blend that new lyrical text in Spanish with Argentinian music, Argentinian folk music. And so he wrote in 1964 the Misa Criolla, which is divided in 5 sections according to the 5 most important moments of Mass, of any Catholic Mass. So we have, I'm going to give you a brief rundown of what the 5 movements are about. So we have the first movement, the Kyrie, which is written as a Vidala. A Vidala is a poetic form from our northwestern region here in Argentina, which the Vidala is written in a way in which it only exists in order to accompany the rhythm of the poetry that's going to be recited. So it's not a very important piece of music when it comes to, I mean, it's not particularly melodic and it doesn't have a grandiose structure. It's just supposed to accompany the rhythm. Then we have the Gloria, which is one of the most important parts of any Catholic Mass, which is written as a carnavalito. The carnavalito is a native dance form from the Altiplano, which if I'm not mistaken, it's called in English the Andean Plateau, from Bolivia and Peru, and northern Chile and Argentina as well. Which is it's a very powerful and a very joyful kind of music, which is, of course, it's very fitting for the Gloria, which in classical music and in classical masses from Bach onwards, you can listen to the Gloria as being a gigantic orchestral movement with a lot of power, a lot of energy, and it happens exactly the same with the Misa Criolla. Then we have the Credo, which is written as a chacarera trunca, which is another folkloric form, a dance from Argentina, particularly from Santiago del Estero province in the north again. There's also a pattern here with the north. He was very fond of northern music. Then the Sanctus repeats the Carnavalito structure. There's not much there. And finally, we have the ending of the Mass, the Agnus Dei, which is written as a style we call the surero, which is another gaucho style from the southern Pampas, which is also often used in order to accompany poetry recitations. So again, most of the music within the Misa Criolla is aimed to accompany the lyrics as much as any mass that has ever been written. But one of the most important elements outside from the composition structures and styles is the fact that what he created was a piece of music, because this is written for an entire symphonic orchestra, but in which the soloists are very specific Andean instruments. So, for example, you have one of the soloists in one of the movements is the charango. The charango is a very small string instrument, relatively similar in form to a guitar, a Spanish guitar. Um, that is, well, nowadays it's mostly made out of wood for ethical reasons, but originally, when it was created by probably by the Quechua people of the north of Argentina and the south of Bolivia, it was made out of an armadillo shell. You can actually find some historical charangos today that still have the armadillo shell as the resonant box. He also incorporated several wind instruments, which have always been an integral part of any native culture in Latin America and in the entire continent as well, like the siku, which is a panpipe, the quena, which is the most traditional Andean flute, which are always made out of bamboo. And also, he decided to make a solo for an instrument, a percussion instrument called the bombo legüero, which is a traditional Argentine drum, which is made out of wood covered with cured animal leather and skin. So what he did was, when you listen to recordings, because you can find recordings of the Misa Criolla done by many artists all over the world. I mean, there's a very famous and quite beautiful rendition of the Misa Criolla sung by Spanish tenor Jose Carreras. But you can always see these particular instruments who were always relegated to be just on folk music who were relegated to never be heard of outside of the countryside. People, not even in the cities, some people not even in the cities have ever heard of the siku or a quena here in Argentina. And yet this composer created a piece that was supposed to be, that was meant to be performed in the largest halls and larger concert halls in the world, introducing native instruments. There's I will try and find a recording of the, because this particular piece was performed at the Vatican at one point, and that must have been a fabulous concert to attend. And again, we're talking about the Vatican. We're talking about the center of the Catholic world, and this man managed to create a piece in which he brought to the Vatican and to many concert halls in Europe and the United States and across the world traditional Argentine instruments like nobody had ever done before.
And I wanted to actually ask you about those instruments, and we're gonna head up to Mexico for our final composer. But before we do, I will say that we probably have a lot of guitarists right now who are wondering what happened to Villa Lobos, and what happened to Agustin Barrios, and what happened to the great classical guitar traditions, of which are often very prominent when you talk about classical music in Latin America. And one of the things I think is great about this discussion is because they're so prominent. You can find discussion of that elsewhere. There's a lot of great stuff outside the guitar, but it is notable that there are a lot of stringed instruments, like the guitar, the charango, all over the place. You have the tiple and that pop up all over Latin America, become folk instruments. You have various, as you were talking about, flutes that pop up, all around, and are folk instruments used in folk music. Also, that end up getting incorporated. These sounds get incorporated into the music that we're talking about, and especially with Ramirez's music. Some of the composers seem to take the sounds that would be played on those instruments and play them on a concert flute, or play them on a guitar, on a classical guitar. But
Mhm.
he actually takes the instruments themselves and brings them into that structure.
Yeah, yeah. There's well, yeah. Most guitarists and lovers of the classical guitar probably hate me because of no, I didn't mention Villalobos and Antonio Lauro, but I'd love to. If I had more time, if the podcast were longer, I would spend hours and hours talking about every single one of the Latin American composers, because I'm skipping a lot of people
Absolutely.
that I would love to talk about. But there's a very interesting that's a very interesting question, because the on Reddit we have the too long did not read. So the short version of that answer is basically the Spanish conquest. When the Spanish came to America as a continent, they brought with them, aside from disease and weapons and Bibles, they also brought the Andalusian guitar from Andalusia, which is also this is often called the flamenco guitar, which is very similar to the classical guitar. There's a couple of technical differences, but in general, it's essentially the same instrument. What's the thing with the guitar? It's a very easy instrument to reproduce. If you had to create a piano out of thin air, out of the things you had lying around in your house, or a violin or a tuba or a trombone, you would find it considerably difficult, because they lack a lot of easy materials to find. You require very specific wood. You require very specific strings. When you want to create a regular stringed instrument that just produces any kind of sound, the guitar is the go-to, because not because it doesn't produce a complex sound, but because it's easier to produce a sound with a guitar than it is with most other stringed instruments, for which you usually need to use a bow. if you wanted to play a violin entirely with a pizzicato, just using your fingers and the strings, you would end up breaking your fingers and breaking your strings because they are not supposed to be used that way, not constantly. The guitar is a considerably more sturdy instrument. It can withstand more hardship and more pain than most regular instruments because most instruments are extremely fragile. The guitar is much more sturdy, and it allows for creative construction. So, for example, when you see a charango, the charango is a very small instrument, but it produces a very powerful sound. But originally, the strings were just made, like most original strings, with gut from animals, like most original strings in Europe during the early years of the creation of stringed instruments. Um, if you were to have to create an instrument that you could make and that you could keep almost anywhere in any circumstances and it would still make a sound, you would choose an easy to reproduce instrument like the guitar in this case. So most people, most communities in Latin America saw the guitar as a way to have music in their lives that didn't cost much, that with enough skill and training they could actually make their own, because we have a lot of great people, a lot of people who are capable of creating guitars and charangos and other sort of stringed instruments like that out of scraps. It's amazing. You can find some luthiers who are capable of creating things here in Argentina or in other countries, beautiful instruments out of basically what they had lying around in their houses, which is not something that you'll be able to do with other instruments.
That's an interesting answer because I was talking and you've talked about the flutes as well. Flutes, you have a bit of cane or bamboo or wood or whatever it is, and they're not too hard to create some kind of flute. Same with percussion instruments. There's a lot of fairly simple designs, and that seems to be such a backbone of the sound of the music, and it makes sense that
Exactly.
the guitar would also fit into that, something that's easily created, easily played, and can make a lot of noise, which is always
Exactly.
good.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the exact objective. Yeah.
Well, we're gonna finish up with a composer, and this is something that I think you talked a little bit about, and I think is also very important. This composer is actually alive, which is not always the case, not often the case when we're actually talking about composers. Usually, we tend to like the dead ones, don't we?
Yeah.
But this composer is alive and also the uses the sounds of his home country, which is again is so evocative, especially for people here in the U.S. When you think Latin America, often people are thinking of Mexico.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. We are, for many people in the US, we are all Mexicans. Um,
That's a whole other discussion.
that's another topic, but everything south of the border is Mexican. But no, in all seriousness, yeah, Arturo Marquez was born in 1950, so he's very much alive. He's very much kicking and still composing, conducting his own works even in many an occasion. He's an interesting guy because he wasn't a child prodigy. He's the only one so far who wasn't a child prodigy, but he was still a prodigy because he only started playing music when he was 16. But at age 16, he decided to start studying the violin, the trombone, the tuba, and the piano simultaneously. Um,
Wow.
and
Start easy and then
yeah,
work hard.
yeah, and he became extremely
Wow.
proficient in all of them at the same time. For by the time he was 18, he was already a professional musician. He was very fond of Mexican music, but also of Central American music in general, particularly Cuban. He is very fond of Cuban music, and Afro-Cuban music in particular. And he started his career playing. He didn't compose much. He just composed as a hobby in his free time. He didn't publish anything until he was like 33. He spent most of his time just performing and conducting with different Mexican folkloric music ensembles. But then in the 80s, he started publishing music, and he became fairly well known in Mexico and in Latin America in general because, again, he creates music that is particularly oriented towards mixing large orchestral ensembles, usually symphony orchestras, and scoring for music that is written for a mixture of classical and native and folkloric dance styles. So, for example, the I sent you two links that we are going to link in the Reddit post. One of them is called La Conga del Fuego Nuevo, which means the new fire conga, which I think everyone has heard the word conga at some point because of a particularly popular song. um, but the conga is which is often associated with Mexico again, but it is not a Mexican style. It is a Cuban style, an Afro-Cuban dance style, which is has one requirement. You can play a conga with any instrument in the world so long as it has a percussion companion. It was created as a way from improvisation. It was born from improvisation in the Cuban carnival comparsas, which comparsas are just spontaneous ensembles of musicians and dancers and singers who, during the carnivals on the street, they just start performing improvisations and they create music, and that's how conga was born. And what's interesting to me about Arturo Marquez's music is the fact that he, from all of the composers that I've chosen to talk about today, he's the most joyful one. His music is extremely powerful, extremely energetic, because it tries to resemble and it tries to bring to the spotlight the music of the Caribbean islands and of Mexico, which is usually very powerful, very elegant, but with the ability to incite multitudes of people to dance. And there's a very interesting element in particularly in Mexican music, Mexican folk music, especially in mariachi music, that it's there's a very strange mixture of very happy, usually very happy melodies and music, and very sad and depressing lyrics. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but it's very interesting because the mariachi music tends to be very strong and a lot of wind instruments, just blaring music, and but the lyrics tend to be often very depressing. Um, and what I find with Arturo Marquez is that he does something similar because he takes the traditional orchestra structure, which has always been mostly associated to very formal settings. Again, we go back to the idea of classical music being designed only and being reserved only for formal settings and for tuxedos. And when you listen to the music written by Arturo Marquez and when you see him directing his work, or other people, as I sent you a link with Mexican conductor Alondra de la Parra, they actually sing. They actually dance with the orchestra. It's amazing to see them dancing while conducting because the music this man writes is supposed to be danced. It's not supposed to be just listened to sitting solemnly and quietly, but it's supposed to move you to your core.
Absolutely. I will say that of all of the clips that you sent me, these, you can say which one is your favorite or your, or whatever, but these are definitely the most fun. These two pieces, these, and have that feel, even just the sound of of some of the instruments. I just think, talk about a simple instrument, the claves. You start hearing those, and you start getting that tap in your toes, and you start moving, as you said. The conductors are moving along with the orchestra. It doesn't feel like you're at a classical concert where everyone's supposed to sit quietly and be formal and upright. It's a lot of fun. It's those two pieces again that you'll be able to see up on the Reddit post.
Yeah, that's definitely the beauty of it, and that's why I wanted to include someone who's still writing music today, who's still making music that feels young and energetic. Because again, when you study music for a living, when you write about music for a living, you're often transported to settings and to places in which you are supposed to be your best self. You're supposed to be in your best behavior because that's what life looked like. That's what life looked like for Bach or for Vivaldi, but not necessarily. I mean, that's maybe what we project, but maybe, just maybe, and this is wishful thinking. Maybe they had fun. Maybe they had the same kind of fun that Arturo Marquez has with his music.
Yeah, it's the thing that I've always really kind of gotten annoyed at is the whole don't clap between movements, and I kind of understand why some people like that, but sometimes you just want to clap.
Yeah,
Sometimes
of
you
course.
just want to clap.
Sometimes you just listen to something that is absolutely mind blowing and breathtaking, and you just need to express that, and you have to wait.
But there's certainly a lot of unbridled energy in that Marquez clips. There's a lot of energy in a lot of the clips you sent, and in a lot of the music. And maybe we'll try to link, a few other composers as well. We didn't get to one of my favorites, Astor Piazzolla, who is another one that straddles those lines between the tango, but bringing in jazz, bringing in classical, and all that into a very Argentinian art form in there. I don't know if there's anyone else that you'd like to highlight, but certainly there's a wealth of music coming from Latin
Oh,
America.
absolutely. I would love to do an entire podcast talking about Piazzolla. Uh, but yeah, there's much more musical production here in Latin America than most people in the northern hemisphere realize. Because again, we continue to live in a classical music world in which Europe is the center of the universe, in which we still look to Europeans when it comes to thinking about new compositions. We still look towards Vienna when we want to find a new composer. Um, and well, there's a lot of great stuff being produced and has been being produced for centuries here, right here. But I
it's
think that
it's
I
a
think that's the case with many, not just with Latin America. That's also the case with the U.S. Because there's a lot of people who think that the U.S. doesn't really have composers, and that's simply not true. Uh, you even have one of the most important and one of the most magnificent female composers in history, Amy Beach, who was an amazing and accomplished composer and teacher and pianist, and she was from the U.S.
Yes, and there's so much here. I mean, she's a great example of somebody who I'm from Massachusetts, and she was from New England as well. Spent much of her life and career, around there. When she was growing up, and having performed by the Boston Symphony Orchestra, Handel and Haydn Society. People don't necessarily know that, and as you said, people end up looking towards Vienna, looking towards Paris, looking towards London or Berlin, and there's so much wonderful music. I have mentioned a couple things about a visit to Buenos Aires and Argentina before, but the Teatro Colón is an absolutely incredible space just to stand in, let alone hear a concert in. And there are a lot of really amazing, looking and sounding concert halls all around Latin America. So anybody who is traveling to those parts, highly recommended to go out, check out a concert, especially if they are local composers. I think
Absolutely.
that's really wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, Seb, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for enlightening us about at least some aspects of a really broad topic, but a really fascinating one. And as I said, I hope that people will check out not only the podcast, but listen to the music as well, because there is a lot there.
Yeah, definitely. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Tyler. And well, I hope people enjoy. And well, let's leave the people the links, and maybe we'll have a discussion about what people enjoy the most. We'll make a meta thread out of it.
Sounds great. Well, Seb Lewin joining us from down in Argentina. I'm Tyler Alderson, and thank you so much, Seb. Thank you to everybody listening. Check out those posts on Reddit, all those YouTube links that we're going to drop. You'll have hours of listening to do, but promise you it is worth it. And that was this episode of the Ask Historians podcast.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.